California. Winter, 1964. A quiet afternoon that looked no different from any other. Cars passed on Broadway Street. People went about their lives unaware that, behind a locked door, something was about to happen that would quietly reshape martial arts forever. There was no crowd, no cameras, no announcements. Only 11 people would witness it. One of them was Bruce Lee. And according to those who were there, this was not his most famous fight. It was not his longest fight. It was not even his most violent fight. But it was, without question, his most dangerous. Not because he almost lost. Not because he was injured. But because of what the fight revealed, about his limits, his philosophy, and how close he came to discovering that everything he believed might not be enough. This is the fight Bruce Lee rarely spoke about. Not because he was afraid of it, but because it forced him to confront a truth that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. It began days earlier. Bruce Lee was 24 years old and already dangerous, not just as a fighter, but as an idea. He was teaching openly, teaching aggressively, teaching differently. His school in Oakland was not exclusive. His students were not all Chinese. And his lessons did not revolve around preserving tradition. They revolved around effectiveness. In the martial arts world of the early 1960s, that was unforgivable. For generations, knowledge had been guarded. Styles were inherited, not questioned. Forms were preserved, not challenged. To many traditional masters, martial arts were not meant to evolve. They were meant to be protected. Bruce Lee rejected that completely. He believed that truth could not belong to a single culture. That efficiency mattered more than ritual. That a technique that failed under pressure had no right to exist. That belief made him enemies long before it made him famous. Word spread quickly through San Francisco's Chinatown. Elders whispered his name with irritation. Younger practitioners watched with curiosity. Bruce Lee, they said, was arrogant, disrespectful, reckless. A man who talked too much about fighting but had not yet been tested in the old way. Some believed he needed to be humbled. Others believed he needed to be stopped. On December 1st, a messenger arrived at Bruce Lee's school. He entered without ceremony, without greeting, without hesitation. He handed Bruce an envelope and left just as silently. Inside was a challenge. It was formal, polite, ruthless. Bruce Lee was accused of violating ancient codes. He was told to stop teaching non-Chinese students immediately. If he refused, the matter would be settled in the traditional way, by combat. Bruce listened as the letter was translated. Then he smiled. Not out of confidence. Not out of arrogance. Out of amusement. He folded the letter, placed it in his pocket, and continued teaching as if nothing had happened. But those who knew him noticed something shift. His movements sharpened. His voice became quieter. His focus narrowed. Bruce Lee had accepted the challenge long before he ever said yes. 2 days later, the man chosen to face him arrived in Oakland. Wong Jack Man. He was not a thug. Not a street fighter. Not an amateur. He was a respected practitioner of traditional northern Shaolin Kung Fu. Trained. Disciplined. Experienced. He did not come out of anger. He came out of obligation. When Wong Jack Man walked into Bruce Lee's school, he did not insult him. He did not threaten him. He spoke calmly, formally, in Cantonese. He delivered the terms. One fight. No public audience. Witnesses from both sides. If Bruce Lee won, he could teach whoever he wanted. If he lost, he would close his school and stop teaching outsiders. Bruce Lee did not hesitate. He asked for 2 days. Saturday, 2 p.m. That was all he said. In the days that followed, Bruce Lee trained differently. He did not rehearse forms. He did not practice elaborate combinations. He drilled fundamentals obsessively, footwork, timing, distance, interception. Over and over. Again and again. He was not preparing for a demonstration. He was preparing for something far more dangerous. Saturday arrived cold and gray. Bruce Lee unlocked his school early. He cleared the space himself. Moved equipment aside. created room to move. At exactly 2 p.m., Wong Jackman arrived. He was not alone. 5 martial artists entered with him. Then 2 older men, respected figures from the traditional community. Bruce Lee understood immediately. This was not just a fight. It was a judgment. They positioned themselves along the walls. Silent. Watchful. Moments later, 3 of Bruce Lee's students arrived. Somehow they had heard. Bruce hesitated, then allowed them inside. 11 people. No cameras. No photographs. No referee. Just 11 human memories that would later fracture into different versions of the same event. Wong Jackman stepped forward and warmed up using traditional forms, precise, disciplined, beautiful. Bruce Lee did not warm up. He stood still, observing. Calm. Almost unervingly so. The rules were brief. No eye attacks. No groin strikes. No throat strikes. Fight until one man could not continue. Then one word was spoken. Begin. At first, nothing happened. They circled, measured, studied. Wong Jackman held a classic stance, balanced, grounded, composed. Bruce Lee's posture was different. Lower, lighter, constantly shifting. Not fixed, not formal. The first attack came from Wong Jackman, a straight punch, fast and clean. Bruce Lee slipped it effortlessly. No counter. Another attack. A combination. Bruce blocked, checked, retreated. To the traditional witnesses, it looked controlled. Familiar. Correct. To Bruce Lee's students, something else was happening. Bruce wasn't fighting yet. He was collecting information. Then the pace increased. Wong Jackman pressed forward, launching sequences designed to overwhelm. Bruce Lee gave ground. He retreated. He absorbed. He watched. Seconds passed. Then more. Some witnesses later claimed Bruce looked pressured. Others claimed he was relaxed. Memory would begin to diverge even here. Then Bruce Lee stopped retreating. Wong Jackman threw another punch. Bruce intercepted it. He trapped the arm, stepped inside, and everything changed. What followed happened so quickly that even those watching struggled to describe it. Bruce Lee unleashed a series of short, explosive punches, direct, efficient, relentless. Not wide swings. Not theatrical strikes. Each blow had purpose. Wong Jackman tried to create distance. Bruce Lee denied it. Every step back was cut off. Every attempt to reset was smothered. This was no longer a traditional exchange. This was pressure, constant, suffocating pressure. The room grew tense. This was not how challenge matches were supposed to look. Wong Jackman adapted. He moved laterally, threw kicks, tried angles. Bruce adjusted instantly. He flowed into space. He intercepted movement. He refused to let the fight return to form. Minutes passed. Breathing changed. Wong Jackman began to tire. Then, in a decision born of necessity, he shot forward for a takedown. This was unexpected. Not traditional. Desperate. Bruce sprawled, wrapped him up, and struck from close range. The fight broke into motion around the room. Tables bumped, equipment shifted, witnesses pressed back against the walls. This was chaos. This was danger. Bruce Lee pursued relentlessly. Not wildly, but with intent. He cut off escape. He maintained pressure. He forced Wong Jackman to carry weight, fatigue, fear. Around the 5th minute, Wong Jackman's movements slowed. His techniques lost precision. His footwork faltered. Then his back hit the wall. For a brief moment, the fight paused, not because it was over, but because everyone in the room felt it could end right there. One of the older masters shouted for it to stop. Bruce Lee halted mid-motion. He looked at Wong Jackman and asked a simple question. "Can you continue?" Wong Jackman nodded. The fight resumed. This was no longer about technique. It was about will. Wong Jackman attacked again, one last effort, fueled by pride and endurance. Bruce Lee intercepted, swept him off his feet, and followed him to the floor. This time, there was no escape. Bruce pinned him, controlled him. and asked again if he was finished. Accounts differ after that. Some say Wong Jackman verbally submitted. Others say he simply stopped resisting. But all agree on one thing. The fight was over. Bruce Lee stood up first. Exhausted. Sweating. Uninjured, but shaken. The traditional masters bowed and conceded. But Bruce Lee did not celebrate. He did not smile. He did not raise his hands. Instead, he said something no one expected. That took too long. The room fell silent. Bruce Lee began criticizing himself. His efficiency. His conditioning. His decision-making. He spoke of wasted energy. Of flaws. Of vulnerability. If there had been multiple attackers, he said, he would have been in trouble. If a weapon had been involved, the outcome could have been different. To everyone else, he had just won. To Bruce Lee, he had just been exposed. That was what made this fight the most dangerous of his life. Not the opponent, but the realization. In the days that followed, Bruce Lee changed everything. His training, his teaching, his philosophy. He abandoned rigid systems. He dismantled tradition piece by piece. What mattered was not style. What mattered was truth. In the weeks after the fight, stories began to spread. Conflicting stories. Wong Jackman described the fight as inconclusive. Others described it as decisive. Some emphasized rule violations. Others emphasized dominance. Bruce Lee rarely commented. Privately, however, something remarkable happened. 3 days later, Bruce Lee met Wong Jackman in private. Only one other person was present. Bruce did not boast. He did not argue. He expressed respect, gratitude, and then he made an unusual request. He asked Wong Jackman not to tell a definitive version of the story, not to deny the fight, not to lie, but to leave it ambiguous. Bruce explained that public humiliation would benefit no one, that endless challenges would distract from progress, that the real lesson was not victory, but evolution. Wong Jackman agreed. And that is why, to this day, there is no single version of what happened behind that locked door. The truth exists somewhere between memories. What cannot be disputed is what followed. Bruce Lee emerged from that fight changed. He became obsessed with efficiency, with speed, with simplicity, with interception. Jeet Kune Do was born not from triumph, but from dissatisfaction. The most dangerous fight Bruce Lee ever fought was not against Wong Jackman. It was against his own limitations. And he refused to lose. 11 people witnessed the fight. The rest of the world witnessed what it created. In the years that followed, Bruce Lee would rarely mention that afternoon in Oakland. When people asked him about challenge matches, about rival styles, about who he had beaten and who he had not, he would usually redirect the conversation. He spoke instead about principles, about simplicity, about honesty in movement. To those who knew him closely, this silence was not avoidance. It was respect, because that fight had taken something from him before it gave him anything back. 4 weeks after, Bruce replayed it relentlessly in his mind. Not the victory, but the moments where things slowed, where he chased instead of intercepted, where fatigue crept in, where instinct faltered. He saw how thin the margin truly was between control and chaos. And that realization disturbed him deeply. Until then, Bruce Lee had believed he was ahead of the curve. Faster, sharper, more evolved than the traditions he criticized. The fight forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth. He was right in principle, but not yet in execution. He had survived the fight. But survival was not enough. Bruce became harsher with himself. Training sessions grew shorter but more intense. He stripped movements down to their core. If a technique required excessive motion, it was discarded. If it relied on perfect conditions, it was rejected. Hack away at the unessential, he wrote later. This was not poetic language. It was a response to danger. The fight also changed how he viewed opponents. Wong Jackman was not weak. He was not unskilled. He was disciplined, courageous, and committed. And still, in a real confrontation, much of what he relied on failed under pressure. That wasn't an insult to tradition. It was a warning. Bruce realized that tradition, when protected from questioning, becomes fragile. Beautiful, yes, but brittle. And brittle things shatter when reality strikes them hard enough. This insight would isolate him. Traditionalists became more hostile. Purists dismissed him. Even some of his own students struggled to follow the direction he was moving toward. Jeet Kune Do had no uniforms. No fixed curriculum. No hierarchy to hide behind. It demanded personal responsibility. That scared people. Bruce Lee didn't care. Because once you felt genuine danger, once you've stood in a room with no cameras, no applause, no escape routes, you stop performing. You start refining. Years later, when Bruce Lee achieved global fame, people saw only the polished result. The speed. The precision. The confidence. They saw a man who looked untouchable. They did not see the hours spent dismantling his own ego. They did not see the memory of a fight that refused to let him rest. When Bruce Lee died in 1973, tributes poured in from around the world. Actors, athletes, martial artists, all praised his genius. His influence. His philosophy. Quietly, among the mourners, was Wong Jackman. He did not speak to reporters. He did not correct stories. He did not defend his version or attack Bruce's. He bowed once, silently, and left. Years later, when asked why he had attended, Wong Jackman gave a simple answer. I learned something about myself because of him. That may be the truest legacy of that fight. Not who won. Not how long it lasted. Not which techniques were used. But that two men walked away changed. Bruce Lee never wanted this fight to define him. He wanted what came after to matter more. And it did. Because the most dangerous fight Bruce Lee ever faced was not the one witnessed by 11 people behind a locked door in Oakland. It was the lifelong fight against complacency. Against comfort. Against the temptation to believe that what worked yesterday would be enough tomorrow. That is a fight most people lose without ever realizing they were in it. Bruce Lee refused to. And that refusal is why the story still matters. Because if this fight were only about punches and kicks, it would have faded long ago. It would have become just another disputed footnote in martial arts history, argued over in magazines, forums, and dojos, then slowly buried under louder legends. But it wasn't just a fight. It was a moment of reckoning. Bruce Lee walked into that school believing he was prepared. He walked out knowing he was not prepared enough. That distinction defined everything that followed. Most people experience victory as confirmation. Bruce experienced it as exposure. That is rare. Dangerous, even. Because once you see your own limits clearly, you lose the comfort of ignorance forever. From that point on, Bruce Lee no longer trained to look impressive. He trained to remove uncertainty. He trained to shorten encounters, to end conflict before fatigue, chaos, or chance could intervene. He trained as if every second mattered, because that fight had shown him that seconds were exactly where things went wrong. He began cross-training obsessively. Western boxing for footwork and timing. Fencing for interception and economy of motion. Wrestling for control and balance. Weight training for explosiveness. Cardio for endurance. Anatomy and biomechanics to understand why certain movements failed under stress. This was not curiosity. It was urgency. The fight had revealed a terrifying possibility, that brilliance without ruthless refinement could still get you hurt. Bruce Lee refused to let that happen again. When people later watched him move, really watched, they sensed something different. His speed wasn't just fast. It was interruptive. His strikes didn't build up. They arrived. His footwork didn't circle aimlessly. It cut lines. There was no excess. No wasted motion. That economy was paid for with self-doubt, repetition, and an unwillingness to protect his own legacy. Ironically, that is what turned him into a legend. Most legends are built by polishing strengths and hiding weaknesses. Bruce Lee did the opposite. He hunted his weaknesses and refused to look away when he found them. That is why the Oakland fight remains uncomfortable. Not because it threatens Bruce Lee's image, but because it challenges the fantasy people want to believe about mastery. The fantasy says, reach a high enough level, and you're done. The reality says, the higher you climb, the less margin you have for error. Bruce Lee understood that earlier than most. That locked-door fight, witnessed by only 11 people, stripped away the illusion of arrival. It told him there was no final form, no perfect system, no moment where growth could stop safely. Only adaptation, only honesty, only continuous pressure against yourself. That is why Bruce Lee never framed that fight as a victory. Victories can make you comfortable. Lessons make you dangerous. And that is why, decades later, people are still drawn to this story, not because they want to know who won, but because they recognize the fear Bruce Lee faced when he realized he still wasn't good enough. They recognize it because they've felt it too. In their work, in their bodies, in their ambitions. That moment when success doesn't satisfy, and the silence afterward asks a terrifying question. Is this really all you've got? Most people silence that question. Bruce Lee listened to it. And that decision, more than any punch, any philosophy, any film, explains why his influence never faded. 11 people saw the fight. Millions felt the echo. And that echo still asks the same question today. What would happen if you stopped protecting who you are, and started becoming who you need to be? That question haunted Bruce Lee for the rest of his life. Not in a dramatic way. Not as fear, but as a constant pressure, quiet, persistent, impossible to ignore. It followed him into every training session, every rehearsal, every late night spent reading about movement, physics, and human reaction time. He began to understand something most fighters never do. That danger doesn't come from the opponent you can see. It comes from the assumptions you carry into the fight. In Oakland, behind that locked door, Bruce Lee realized that assumptions were lethal. He had assumed conditioning would carry him. That speed would compensate. That pressure alone would end the fight quickly. And yet the fight stretched on. Minutes passed. Breath shortened. Variables multiplied. That terrified him. Because if a controlled, one-on-one confrontation could spiral into chaos, what would happen outside that room? On concrete. In darkness. Against more than one attacker? Against someone who didn't fight correctly? Bruce knew the answer. You wouldn't rise to your expectations. You would fall to your preparation. From that day forward, Bruce Lee trained for unpredictability. He stopped asking, "Is this technique correct?" and started asking, "Does this survive pressure?" If the answer was no, it didn't matter how elegant it looked or how long it had been taught. It was discarded. This mindset bled into everything. His films changed. His movements became sharper, more stripped down. Even his acting carried a different intensity, not performative, but present. There was no excess emotion. No wasted expression. People felt it, even if they couldn't explain it. They sensed that Bruce Lee was not playing a role. He was expressing a conclusion. The Oakland fight also reshaped his relationship with ego. Before, ego had fueled him, pushed him to challenge tradition, to speak boldly, to provoke discussion. After, ego became something to be managed carefully. He saw how easily confidence could turn into complacency. So he turned ruthless with himself. He questioned every belief, every habit, every movement pattern. He kept what worked and destroyed what didn't, even when it meant dismantling parts of his own identity. That takes a special kind of courage. Because most people don't fear failure. They fear having to start over. Bruce Lee chose to start over anyway. That is why Jeet Kune Do was never meant to be a system. It was never supposed to become fixed, preserved, or repeated blindly. It was a snapshot of Bruce Lee's thinking at a moment in time, a living process, not a destination. And that process began in danger. Real danger. The kind that strips away mythology and leaves you alone with the truth. That is why Bruce Lee never wanted this fight celebrated. He didn't want it dramatized, exaggerated, or turned into a symbol of dominance. He knew what symbols did. They froze ideas in place. And Bruce Lee despised stagnation. He wanted people to focus on the question the fight forced him to confront, not the outcome it produced. What happens when what you believe is no longer enough? That question is uncomfortable. It demands humility. It demands effort. It demands change. Most people avoid it their entire lives. Bruce Lee ran toward it. And that is why the most dangerous fight he ever faced wasn't the one witnessed by 11 people in Oakland. It was the moment afterward, when he stood alone in that quiet room, exhausted, victorious, and deeply dissatisfied, and chose growth over comfort. That choice is why his legacy still breathes. That choice is why his ideas refuse to age. That choice is why, long after the noise fades and the arguments die out, the lesson remains. Danger doesn't end when the fight is over. Sometimes, that's when it begins. And that is the part most people miss. They think the danger was in the punches, in the takedown, in the exhaustion. But the real danger came afterward, when Bruce Lee had the perfect excuse to stop questioning himself. He had won. He had proven his point. He had silenced his critics. Most people would have built a throne on that moment and defended it for the rest of their lives. Bruce Lee burned it down. He understood something most never will. The moment you start protecting your reputation, you stop protecting your future. The moment you cling to victory, you turn it into a ceiling. That fight could have frozen him in time. Instead, it fractured him, and through that fracture, something far more dangerous emerged. A man who no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. A man who was willing to dismantle himself over and over again. A man who refused to let success lie to him. That is why the fight stayed private. Why the stories conflicted. Why there were no photographs, no trophies, no public declarations. Because the fight was never meant to be remembered. The lesson was, behind that locked door in Oakland, 11 people watched 2 men test each other. But only one man walked away determined to never be satisfied again. And that is why Bruce Lee became more than a fighter. He became a warning. A warning that mastery is fragile. That comfort is dangerous. That tradition without truth will eventually collapse under pressure. The most dangerous fight Bruce Lee ever fought didn't end when Wong Jackman hit the floor. It began the moment Bruce Lee asked himself a question most people are too afraid to face. Is this really the best I can be? And then refused to accept the answer. 11 people witnessed the fight. But the consequences reached far beyond that room. They are still reaching us now. Because the real legacy of Bruce Lee isn't found in who he